get in line, because there's always been a sky council, according to our ancestors.
Realization that we keep kind of incarnating until we learn to be loving beings in all circumstances.
Then Moses says to Aaron, don't say anything. Don't say anything, because I've told you he's like this.
Paradigm shifting, thought expanding, unexpected. This is not a debate, it's a convergence. The Synergy Sessions, where ideas converge, new worlds emerge.
Hello. What if everything you thought you knew about the Bible was only part of the story? With me today are two extraordinary scholars, Catholic priest and psychologist Father Seán ÓLaoire and former Archdeacon of the Anglican Church in Australia, Paul Anthony Wallis, both acclaimed authors who've dared to ask forbidden questions, like who or what was the biblical God? What truths were edited out of sacred texts? Why were ancient stories rewritten, merged and mistranslated? And what clues have we ignored about humanity's deeper origins and our potential future? From courtroom trials of Yahweh to ancient memories of ET contact to the suppressed teachings of reincarnation and divine feminine wisdom to redefining God, Yahweh, and the nature of divinity. Be warned, this conversation will dismantle inherited dogma and open the door to a far more expansive and inclusive vision of divinity. Paul Anthony Wallis, Father Seán ÓLaoire, welcome.
G'day,
Thanks,
Sandie.
Sandie.
Thank you for having me.
So good to have you both here. So to start us off, I'm going to ask each of you, and I don't know which one wants to go first. How do you define God based on your own personal experience and research? Seán, would you like to go first?
Sure, yeah. So for me, it's interesting that so many of the great traditions kind of differentiate, like in Hinduism, they differentiate between Brahma and Parabrahma. You know, in Christian mysticism, Meister Eckhart will talk about Godhead and God. And in my words, I differentiate between the transcendence of the divine and the immanence of the divine. So of the transcendence of God, we can say nothing. It is totally ineffable. We can experience it, but we cannot articulate it. And then there's the eminence, as, you know, as God, as she manifests herself through creation. And so for me, then, I would never attempt to say who God is, but only say who God is not. And so for me, God is not a person. So that's a word, for instance, that got imported from the Greek prosopon, when the church fathers were trying to wrestle with the notion of a trinity. You know, and so what they used the word prosopon, which meant in Greek just a mask. So it was about what are the ways in which we experience the divine? And prosopon got translated into Latin as persona, from a mask as well. So persona means as a whole, you're sounding through it. So persona, you're sounding. And we mistook that, then we created person and personality from that. And now we wind up with some ontologically discrete entities sitting on thrones. One guy with a long beard, you know, the other guy is actually a pigeon flying around, and the other has holes in his hands. So this notion of a trinity is crazy. So I don't believe in the personhood of God. I don't believe that God is a law enforcer or a lawmaker in the sense of, you know, laying down dictates. I don't believe that God is partisan in that way, that he is a judge and that he's a favorite people or a favorite religion. And so I go along with the Hindu notion of neti, X. No, God is not X. Y? No. What about Z? No, God is not Z. So we can kind of back ourselves into the experience of the transcendent, you know, by attempting to kind of differentiate and kind of define how we think God is. So God for me is the ground of all being, in the sense that all that arises comes from, Lao Tzu that said very famously, all things come from being, but being comes from non-being. And so all I can say about God is God is not being, you know, utterly transcendent, can be experienced, but cannot be articulated. So as long as we're prepared to swim in the waters of the mystery, we're great. As long as we try to kind of determine what the water is composed of, we're in trouble.
Paul, what's your definition?
Seán, I love how you went at that question. That was an absolute picture of the apophatic way.
Yes.
Which is, of course, to say what God is not. And so we're moving away from things that give us hard edges and boundaries onto a journey of exploration. And you mentioned Meister Eckhart. I love how Meister Eckhart did that.
Yeah.
He was living at a time where it was very difficult to breathe anything that wasn't the Catholic orthodoxy.
Yes.
And so very cleverly, he said, Godhead has revealed itself as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Godhead is a word we don't really use. We might say divinity today. Divinity has revealed itself as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Let's talk about divinity. And all of a sudden, he's given himself permission to move away from these hard-edged, bounded concepts that we think we understand. And now we're on a journey of discovery.
Yes.
And that's been my own experience, really, to begin my life as a Christian believer, which I guess happened when I was about 17 years old, beginning with these fairly hard-edged concepts and then moving away from them. And like many Christian believers, I wanted to sound intelligent and have people take me seriously and give the impression that I had a very sophisticated and deep understanding of what God might be. But in the end, it really did boil down to some of the caricatures that you, Seán, just mentioned. You know, the Almighty King who dictates what we should and shouldn't do, the one who must be obeyed, the one who issues laws, the Almighty Magician who can magic his way into your life and change circumstances. It took me a long time to realize, actually, I was really doing business with that immature concept of God, this Father Christmas in the sky image. It took me a long time to accept that my vision of God wasn't very deep and very sophisticated after all, but that had settled for this scaled down prosopon, this scaled down face or version or image of God. Now I rather like the definitions that I find in Plato and in the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. And so Plato goes into some detail as to how he uses the word God, and it's in a number of different ways. But when you get to his ultimate concept of God, the source of the universe, drill down into it, it seems that he's talking about what we might describe as a unified field of consciousness.
Yes. Yep.
And that consciousness preceded the material universe. And when I rediscovered that in Plato, that really started ringing bells with me. And he argued that the whole of the material cosmos is an emanation of that consciousness, that it exists in order for that divine source consciousness to express itself and experience itself. And having rediscovered Plato, I then went back to the Apostle Paul, and I realized that at his highest moments, where he's going deepest into clarifying his terms, his thoughts were not so different to Plato's. And so we find that coming out in a sermon that he gives in Acts 17, where he's talking to a non-religious audience. And when I say non-religious, I mean non-Jewish, non-Christian. So Paul has to clarify what he means by theos, the Greek word for God. And he gives a pretty good explanation of the Greek understanding of God. And he says, and I'm putting a couple of sentences together in that sermon, he said, by theos, I mean the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being, of which we are all offspring.
Beautiful.
And I love that vision of God because there's no separation in that vision. We are all emanations of the source.
Yes.
We're all expressions of the divine. We should fully expect to be having divine experiences, thinking divine thoughts. There's nothing we have to do to get rid of the separation because there is no separation. And I think religion often trades in separation anxiety. You know, the message is you are separated from God. We will show you how to claw your way back into his good books. And in that definition, the rug is pulled out from all that manipulative kind of thinking. No, we are all emanations of the divine, all emanations of the source. And part of the great exploration of life is working out how that feels, what that looks like, and what's possible in the light of that.
That's beautiful. So it reminds me of Plotinus, the 2nd century great philosopher as well, who said he did not believe in creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, but rather emanatio ab Deo. So I got that illustrated for me very powerfully one time. Somebody gave me a vase years ago with a potted plant in it, and it was just a bulb that I couldn't see. And I'm deadly with plants. I either overwater them or I underwater them. So she said to me, all you need to do is stick your finger in the clay. If it's wet, leave it alone. If it's dry, put water in it. So I have it sitting in my bedroom, and after about 2 or 3 weeks, suddenly this huge green stalk emerges from it. Another 2 or 3 weeks, this beautiful kind of trumpet flower emerges. And I asked myself, did the bulb create the stalk? And the answer was no. The stalk was an emanation of the bulb, of its essence. And did the stalk create the flower? No, it didn't. That the flower was an emanation from the same essence from the bulb, so that the bulb contained within itself the possibility of a stalk and the possibility of a flower, and that everything is an emanation from source, exactly as you said. And so I seed my dreams at night. I've been doing that since 1979. And at one stage, I asked my dreams, give me a definition of Christ consciousness. And I woke up about 4 o'clock in the morning, and what I heard was Christ consciousness is the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all things. And so I said exactly what you're saying. There is nothing separated from source. It's only a question of, we've divided these kind of discrete entities and called them as if they were separate. But there is nothing except God. I said there is only God and there is only love.
Seán, remind us, what were Plotinus's dates?
About the year 200 AD.
So we've got Plotinus in the 200s. We've got Paul in the first century of the Common Era.
Right.
We've got Plato talking about it in the 400s to 300s BCE. They all keep bringing us back to this beautiful understanding, but there's always something pushing us the other way into something sort of less empowering, less inspiring, that scales everything back down again. So it seems to be a fresh discovery that every generation has to make.
So it's interesting, you can go back even to kind of Lao Tzu, 550 BCE. They say the very same, it talks about the Tao, the way, the unit of consciousness in some senses. So it's like again and again and again, there are avatars come and try to wake us up, and we go back to sleep because we're given a sleeping pill by the institutions and the bureaucracies of various kinds, because that's how they exercise their control. So we have to resist taking, sleeping pills from organizations.
So what is the driver behind all that? Is it greed, power?
I think actually that one of the other things I got years ago in a dream was I asked for a differentiation between sin and evil. And I woke up again in the morning and the differentiation was this. The message I got was that sin was the kind of individual breaking of a culturally created precept. It's just a human law that you break. That's what sin is. Whereas evil was a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. That there literally is an energy out there in the universe, you can call them ET or whatever, who are dedicated to creating strife on planet Earth because they're literally feeding off the energy of fear, anxiety, and warfare. It's like people setting two dogs fighting at each other and putting bets on it. Or cockfighting or whatever, where you're getting off the distress of animals, you're feeding on it and you're shouting, yeah, go kill the bastard or whatever. And that in some senses, there's energies out there, literally, that are fomenting all kinds of, whether it's anxiety at an individual level or depression at an individual level, or kind of any kind of global hegemony of some kinds and warfare, that's the energy that feeds them. And so that Paul said it very, very powerfully again, and I think it was his letter to the Ephesians, where he says our battle is not just against the forces of this world, but against the dark forces in the heavenly realms. That we're fighting a battle of people who have made Faustian agreements with off-planetary intelligences. That they'll be in power positions and they'll be rewarded with longevity or money or whatever it is. If you facilitate what our agenda is, you become the kind of the food service to us. And you foment all this stress. So I think that's part of what it is, that we're dealing actually with both human frailty and off-planetary influences.
Well, I think you suggest that the God portrayed in the Old Testament may not be the benevolent creator, but a colonizing being.
Yes, I think we've confused a lot of our ancestors' stories by reading them as God stories. And there are a lot of stories, particularly in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, that because they are within a book that we understand to be about God, we assume every story is a revelation of God, is describing God. But in my studies, I found that there are multiple beings washing around in the text called Elohim, powerful ones, who behave in all kinds of ways, many of which are quite anti-human, many of which I believe are cultural recollections of colonization by powerful others and invasion by powerful others. When you read those as God stories, the only way you can make that work is if you understand God to be a violent, woman-hating, human-hating, child-hating, unforgiving, brutal entity. And unfortunately, that is the mathematics a lot of believers do in order to maintain the view that these are God's stories. They end up with a monstrous God as a way of explaining the stories. But unfortunately, if you have a God who is xenophobic, you will have to justify and glorify xenophobia. You will become xenophobic yourself. If your God thinks in terms of those who are my people and those who are not my people, you're forced into thinking in the same way. And it's not difficult to see that that's exactly what has happened. Empires have used the image of a violent, implacable, brutal God to justify violence in the name of God. We've seen that time and time again, right from the moment that Constantine rebranded himself as a Christian and declared through the writings of Eusebius that Jesus endorsed the violence of his armies, but of course of nobody else's. We've seen empires use this distortion to their advantage in that kind of way. I was reading a story just yesterday, see if I can remember where it is. It's Leviticus 9 and 10, where two sons of Aaron has been set up as the priest of Yahweh. Two sons of Aaron seek to do something to calm Yahweh, the Elohim, down. And what they have to do to calm him down is to produce particular smells. And so Yahweh loves the smell of burning animal flesh. It stops him being angry. It calms him down. Yeah. He likes the smell. And so they produce the smell. They take it in to Yahweh or before Yahweh, as the text says. But Yahweh doesn't like the smell they've made. And so he incinerates them to death. And then Moses says to Aaron, don't say anything. Don't say anything. Because I've told you he's like this. Go and get your cousins, get them to drag those bodies out. And we're supposed to believe that the incinerating Yahweh is the divine source of the cosmos. It doesn't square. It doesn't make sense. As soon as you realize what you've actually got is a collection of stories of violent, non-human others who have colonized bits of land, in particular in the Middle East, as we're reading the stories of the Hebrew scriptures, you're going to come away completely puzzled and wondering what in the world you have to do to avoid being incinerated by Yahweh yourself. My books argue that neither those Yahweh stories nor any of the Elohim stories are stories about God. They're stories of totally other kinds of entity, ones we would do well to avoid emulating.
Great, Paul. Beautiful. Maybe that's the reason why he liked Cain. He liked Aaron's.
Yes, Cain and Abel.
Sacrifice,
that's right.
Not Cain's, right? Meat instead of veggies.
Yep. And it wasn't to eat the meat; it was to burn it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so it reminds me. I have this theory that we've encountered kind of three kinds of divinities. We have what I call regional divinities. So you move into a particular piece of real estate and there's an extraterrestrial presence that's taking occupancy of that. And so you got to count out to that guy. And then the second group I call tribal divinities. So they attach themselves to a group. And if the group is nomadic, they move around with the group. And then the third kind is, I call them portfolio divinities. If you're into agriculture, here's the guy to follow. You're into art, here's the guy. Into sex, here's the guy. Into war, here's the guy. And they're kind of shopping around. And so when the Israelites came into the promised land and found out, there was constant famine, they think, this guy, Yahweh, he might be a great warrior god, he does no diddly squat about agriculture. So let's move over to the Baals or whatever. So they're constantly shopping around for a better divinity to kind of meet them in their needs.
That's exactly right. Yes, that's a really great analysis of it. And that understanding is, of course, embedded not just in the Hebrew scriptures, but you'll hear that in Greek mythology, Norse mythology, in the Vedas as well. Yes, that's a really good summary. And I like the contrast of Yahweh, the war god, with someone like Asherah, for instance,
Yes,
a
yes,
female divinity who taught the people about agriculture.
yes.
And until you understand that framework, it's a nonsense to follow the annals of the tribes of Israel, trying to work out which God they need to be on the right side of while they're living in this land or when they're in this territory.
Right.
Of course, they're making the calculation, who can best help us while we're in this part of the world? Who can best help us when we're at war? Who can best help us when there's no harvest?
Right.
And it's precisely because of that framework that you just outlined.
Yes. And I think that's one of the reasons why early Christianity ran into problems with the Roman Empire, that the Romans were very cognizant of the fact when they moved into a difficult terrain, they wanted to honor the local divinities, make sure they didn't, pardon my French, piss them off. And so they were really upset that the Christians were not honoring the old version of the God, and that they were going to kind of bring down the wrath of God on the Roman occupying forces as well. And so tried to lick them into shape. And so here are the early Christians now trying to avoid the wrath of, the synagogue and the wrath of the Romans at the same time. It's like, what's the way out of this dilemma?
Yes, yes. And it's why so many fusions, of course, happened as well, where the local gods do get honored, but it's given under the appearance of Christianity.
Yes.
So we I mean, what I'm hearing is like, oh, for goodness sake, for millennia, people have been worshipping a gang of bullies.
Yes.
It's like school bullies, and suddenly they've been, put on pedestals and adored and worshipped and obeyed. I mean, how does a society fall into that?
So there was I came across a book years ago, and I just remembered it a few days ago, called Zigzag Zen. Have you ever seen it? And it was a series of interviews that somebody did with Buddhist teachers, well-known Buddhist teachers in the United States of America, all of whom had been into psychedelics in the 60s and had these transcendent experiences. And so the interviewer was trying to find out what's the difference between kind of deep meditative practice and kind of psychedelics. But one of the things I learned from it is that they said there's the four S's. There's the set, the setting, the substance, and the sitter. And by that they mean, what is the mindset with which you undertake a kind of a psychedelic trip? Are you going for a rave? Are you want a spiritual experience? So the mindset is the first thing. The second one is the setting. Are you doing this in a dance hall with loud music? Are you doing it out in the mountains, on your own? The third one is the substance, is it psilocybin, is it ayahuasca, whatever it is. And the fourth one is the sitter. Are you with somebody who's, able to lead you through the kind of the process and has experienced themselves? So they call it the four S's. But I put another one onto it. I call it this substance, in the sense that once they get you into that state, what are they feeding you? And I think that, in fairness, many of the Christian churches, and maybe even particularly Roman Catholicism, in its kind of extraordinary architecture, the cathedrals and the stained glass windows and incense and kind of Gregorian chant, they managed to create this extraordinary setting, that was really elevating a state of consciousness. And then they used it to feed you all this kind of crap. All this orthodoxy, ultra-orthodoxy about we have extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside the Catholic Church, there's no redemption. And there's hell, and there's heaven, and there's limbo, and there's purgatory. An unbaptized baby who's totally sinless still has original sin, so they can't go to heaven. So we actually had special graveyards in Ireland during the famine time, when people were dying like flies. An unbaptized child could not be buried in a Christian graveyard. And so we had special graveyards called Kilini, literally little graveyards, where an unbaptized baby had to be taken at night by the parents and buried. And so now that you've got people in this altered state of consciousness, now you feed them the dogma of the institution, and you kind of dress it with fear of damnation, and that we and we alone are the only kind of authorities, and you follow us and we lead you and tell you how you can get there. You don't follow us, you're damned. And so I think is the fact that they managed to create these extraordinary altered states of consciousness through high liturgies, and then utilize that as a kind of an opportunity to deliver a very, very different kind of a bureaucratic and oligarchical message.
Wow.
Yes. I can illustrate that with the experience of a couple of friends of mine.
Right.
One who was the senior theologian for Watchtower in the UK. So that's the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so he's a theologian. He's in charge of the theological college. He's the lecturer in systematic theology. And through his study of the Bible, their translation of the Bible, he comes to the conclusion that some of the central claims of Watchtower ought to be questioned. And the one that really got his attention was, and I can't repeat the Latin phrase that you just quoted, but the assertion that there's no salvation outside of their organization.
Yes.
And he decided this couldn't be supported even from their own Bible. And so very quietly he started sounding out other members of the faculty. And they said, yes, we came to the same conclusion years ago, but don't breathe a word of that because you'll be thrown out. Never mind your seniority, you will be shunned. But he was a man of integrity. He took it to the senior leadership and he was shunned and he was forced out of the movement, which meant he couldn't see his wife and children anymore. And he moved from that into a more orthodox form of Christianity. There's a funny connection here because the church that he went to next, I had a connection with the senior pastor of this church, an enormous church in London. And I was talking to the senior theologian of the Bible college attached to that church. And I said, I've come to the conclusion that the doctrine of hell is really a total distortion of what's in the Gospels and New Testament. And that the church's teaching of hell as a place of eternal conscious torture for those who are not Christian believers, it's completely false. It's an invention. And he said, yes, please don't breathe a word of that while you're talking to the senior pastor here. It's not that he doesn't agree with you. It's just that he believes that if we admit to that, then no one will come to church anymore. And those are sort of just micro examples of why religious institutions are loath to think freely on these topics. And what was the other example I was going to give of that? Let me think for a moment. That's right. I was working for a Pentecostal denomination in the UK, which out of respect, I won't name because I loved working with them. But in order to hold status with the movement, you had to sign up to, I can't remember whether it was 10 or 12 fundamental truths. And they included some mistakes in them, in my personal humble opinion, which included the hell doctrine. And so I was being encouraged to sign up for ministerial status. And I said, well, I just have some problems with, item 11 and 12. Talk to our senior theologian, they said. So I did. So once again, it's the senior theologian of a Christian movement, principal of the Theological College. And I said, here's one mistake I think that's been made. And by mistake, I mean, the way I had these conversations was I was saying, this isn't faithful to the content of the New Testament. So I think that's an issue for you, isn't it? Yes, it is. So we looked at these topics and he said, yes, look, Paul, I think you're right. And these statements really do need revision, but we're just going to have to wait until a whole generation of leaders in the movement have died before we can really go back to this and any of this can be changed. So that tells you a little bit about the social dynamics of communities of faith. On the one hand, you've got the top-down problem with leaders saying, if people feel free and are not frightened and are not tiptoeing around for fear of offending the Almighty, then what purchase have we got to control and manage the people? But then you've also got a bottom-up pressure as well, where you can send somebody away to theological college, learn all these things about the Bible. That means the new pastor is going to come back thinking, how am I going to break it to my people that a lot of these are not God's stories? There's something else. And he or she finds when they are in situ in their new post, they can't breathe a word of that because the people are sitting in judgment of their doctrine.
Yes.
And if they stray from the fundamental truths, the people or the board are going to say, I'm sorry, Pastor, you can't continue here because you don't believe the things we do. And so there's this policing from both ends of the spectrum that makes it very difficult for communities of faith to deconstruct wrong thinking or even abusive patterns of thinking and get onto something that's truer to the text, truer to the sources, more elevating and more empowering.
Brilliant. I love it, Paul. So, which brings me on to, I invented a word years and years and years ago called mythish. And for me, mythish is the kind of the articulation of sacred wisdom in story form. and that it's appealing to the heart space. It's not appealing to the left brain or to the right brain even. So that when we approach a biblical text, for me, what I look at is, am I meeting this with my left brain, with my right brain, or with my soul self? So I differentiate between wisdom and knowledge. That knowledge is data which are generated by the sensorium and processed by the brain, whereas wisdom is data that are generated by the soul and processed by the heart. And so it's why, for me, that the great teachers always speak in parabolic format. Because as soon as you articulate something in theology or scientific language or philosophical terminology, it's like putting food into a fridge and kind of forgetting to plug the fridge in. It's going to spoil because language changes its meaning. Whereas stories are always evergreen. Parables and metaphors you can unpack for any generation in any circumstance and find sustenance in it. And so there's 2 places in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 13 where Jesus is accused of speaking in parables, and he's why the hell are you talking these stupid parables? And I love the answers he gave. On one occasion he says, I speak in parables so that seeing you may see but not understand, hearing you may hear but not comprehend. In other words, if you're just listening to me with your ears and trying to comprehend me rationally, you're not going to get my message. You need to kind of get metanoia. Metanoia for me it's about going beyond the mind. Metanoia. It's engaging with the material at a soul level, not just an intellectual level. And the second time he's asked, he says, I speak in parables so that I may reveal things which have been hidden since the foundation of the world. That there are some truths which are so important, so deep, that the only way to articulate them or deal with them is some kind of an art form. You can draw pictures, you can dance it, you can do music, you can tell stories, parables or metaphors, but you can't unpack it, theologically or kind of cosmologically or scientifically or philosophically. You go there, you're lost. You're putting your food in a refrigerator that's not plugged in. It's going to spoil.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely profound, Seán. And it's so sad that so many religious believers are not comfortable in the realm of mythish story.
Yes.
Our great teachers, as you say, have all used story to teach. But if believers can't engage with story as story, then they've got a problem. Somehow, I think, since the sort of religious versus science war of the late 1800s, we've come into a place in the West where a lot of believers have the Bible in front of them, and the only question they're asking is, what really happened? As if that's the only grid through which they're going to read these scriptures. But I mean, it's obvious Jesus used story. He told many stories. He tells a story, for instance, of 2 brothers who are asked by their dad if they would go and work in the field, work in the vineyard. And one son says, yes, I will, Daddy. Of course, Daddy. And then doesn't do anything. And then the other son says, no, I've got other things to do. But then he sees the state of the field and of his own accord thinks, oh gosh, that really does need help. And he goes off and he does some work in the field. And Jesus asked the question, which of the 2 sons did the will of the Father? It's a very interesting story because it's the one who said no. Who's actually done the work. And if the Father stands for God in that story, then this is someone who said no to God, who ends up being more useful to God than the one who said yes, butter won't melt, and then doesn't do anything. So it's a very powerful story, really speaks to the nature of God, the nature of spirituality, the value of religion. We all understand this is a fiction. That if you say, well, were there really 2 sons? And their dad asked them to go into the pit. No, there weren't. It was a story that Jesus made up. Great. Okay, well, let's try another one. Jesus tells the story of a rich man who has a poor beggar living at the end of his driveway. And the beggar dies and is taken to the bosom of Abraham. And then we've got the rich man dies. And he's suddenly in trouble. He's in Hades. He's in pain and torture. And the rich man says, do you think I could go back and warn, or could you send the beggar to go and warn my family not to come to this place? And God says, sorry, no, we don't do that. That's not the policy here. A great gulf has been fixed between the living and the dead. Yes, but if someone goes back from the dead and warns, no, even if someone goes back from the dead, that's not going to make any difference. They've got Moses, they've got the teachings. Now we ask the question, did that really happen? Was there a rich man who went to Hades? Was there a poor man who went to the bosom of Abraham? No. No, it's made up. Okay. And is there a gulf between the living and the dead? Well, yes, I think there is. And so is there a protocol that people can't be warned by dead relatives not to come to? I think so. So there is a Hades then where people get taught, yes, I think that's true. And all of a sudden, the boundary between fiction and fact is sliding all over the place, purely on the basis of what the reader or the hearer already believes.
Absolutely.
And then you can take it another step and say, all right, so Jesus made stories up then to teach stuff. What about the people who followed Jesus?
Yeah.
Did his followers teach in the same way?
Yes.
And so therefore, how do we approach the stories about Jesus?
Yes.
Is it all what really happened and what didn't happen?
Yeah.
Or are we also in the realm of teachers who are going to teach us through story, the stories of Jesus? And suddenly believers can become very uncomfortable with that because they want things to be founded on fact. And to present their religious belief as if it's historical or scientific belief. And one of the reasons believers do that is, I think, because of those culture wars at the end of the 19th century. But the other is that we read the Bible in a bubble.
Yes.
And instead of reading it in the context, reading the New Testament, for instance, in the context of other Greek and Roman literature, or reading the Old Testament in the context of Mesopotamian literature, Ugaritic literature. When we don't do that, we'll read a story in the Bible and not recognize what kind of story it is. Once we set it back in that context, we'll read a story and think, I recognize this. This is a trope. This virgin birth story, I've read this before. This resurrection story, I've read this before. This walking on water story, I've read this before. I understand the point the writer's wanting to make here because it's a well-worn trope. But if you haven't set it in that context, if you don't know any Greek or Roman mythology, if you don't know the Mesopotamian stories, the Ugaritic literature, that's when you're vulnerable to reading the Bible as if it's a book of history, a book of science, and there's no other way to look at it.
Beautiful. So it reminds me, go ahead, Sandie.
So I'm curious to know, I mean, as men of the church, the first time that you actually had an aha, or a doubt, or hang on a minute, I need to reassess this. How did you feel?
So I can talk about my own case. I was lucky enough to be raised by grandparents. I had a great grandmother who was a Christian mystic, for whom Mother Mary was absolutely real. She would talk to her aloud during the day, and I would be privy to these conversations. I could only hear one end of it, but Mother Mary was more real to her, than you guys are to me. So I lived with her for the first 6 years of my life, and then I lived with a grandfather on the other side who was he was a druid, and he filled me up with all the great Irish mythology. And mythology, for me, the purpose of mythology is to kind of explain the origin myths of a people, allow us to kind of survive present vicissitude, unify us as a group, and prepare us for the future. So stories become really, really important for me then. And building on that then, I went to Africa at age 26, living on the equator in very, very remote areas. Everybody goes to bed at kind of 7 o'clock at night because it's literally there's 12 hours day, 12 hours night. Being Irish, there was no bloody way I could go to bed at 7 o'clock. And so I had no electricity. I'd have a bunch of candles sitting on the table in front of me. And I started examining the tenets of my own belief system that I was brought up with. And I put them into one or two buckets. If I were born Hindu, or Buddhist, and somebody told me that there's a man in Rome with a big hat that's infallible, would I believe it? And I said, absolutely none. So that goes into one bucket. Do I believe that, the golden rule, as you would, that people should do to you, do you also to them in like manner? Would I believe that if I were born Muslim or Buddhist? Yeah, I would. So I separated my belief systems into two buckets. And then I started creating what I call a personal cosmology. And it was based on 4 questions I asked myself. Who is God? What do I mean when I say God? Secondly, when I say I, what do I mean by I? Am I talking about this kind of spacesuit I wear? Or am I talking about my emotions or my belief systems or my profession or whatever I mean when I say I? Thirdly, what do I mean when I say neighbor? And fourthly, what is my purpose? What the hell am I doing here? And so I kind of constructed a very different kind of a cosmology. And that got me into trouble then, obviously, over time with the church authorities. And I got kicked out of a whole bunch of places, including the Vatican sent me a 2-page letter in Latin on the 4th of October, the Feast of St. Francis, in 2010, telling me they no longer required my services. And so for me, the journey had been seeded as a child and then watered in Africa, and then kind of came to fruition when I came to the States in 1987.
What about you, Paul?
Yes, well, my answer is similarly a long journey, and it began before I would ever have perceived myself as a person of faith when I was about 5 years old. And I remember one Monday morning at school, I went to a public school, a state school, but back in the day, you would still pray Christian prayers and sing Christian hymns, even in a state school. So there's a lot of religion in the system. And on this Monday morning, the headmistress, Mrs. May, said, Mrs. Clark's class are now going to come and teach us a new hymn. Mrs. Clark was the one teacher who could play the piano, so they were always the class who taught the new hymns. And so she came in and they started this hymn that began with the words, when Jesus was a little boy. And the hymn went on to explain, when Jesus was a little boy, he was good as gold. He did everything his mummy and daddy told him. He did everything his school teachers told him, never gave any trouble to anybody. And that, children, is how you should be too. And even as a 10 to 5-year-old, I sat listening, thinking, this is pathetic. This is completely transparent. They have hijacked this Jesus guy simply as a way of trying to control us and manage us and get us to toe the line and do what they want. And I was so unimpressed. I thought you'd have to be an idiot to fall for the story told in that hymn. So that was my first early opinion of how institutions relate to the story of Jesus. And I was very suspicious that there was clear blue water between Jesus and what the institution was doing. And I complained to my dad about this. And I said, these teachers, they talk about God as if they know God or have met God. They haven't. For all they know, God could be a giant green dragon. And my dad was busy reading the newspaper and sort of gave this answer like, yes, I'm sure you're right, Paul. Not sure if he really heard what I said, but it was the right answer. And it encouraged me to maintain my independent mind. And so right from the beginning, I understood that a figure such as Jesus, whether he's a historical figure or a fictitious figure, there's clear blue water between the credibility of that figure and his or her teaching, and then what an institution might say or do in his or her name. That awareness has always been with me from that time to this. And I became a Christian when I was 17, really through reading Erich von Däniken, beginning to ask some bigger questions. And it took me back to Jesus, and I decided, yes, I do think he's a credible figure. I do like his teachings. That's the way I'm going to go. But very quickly, I found that I had questions that my Christian friends couldn't answer to my satisfaction. Why do we treat the Bible in this way? Why is it in this bubble where it's got this authority that nothing else has? They couldn't really, where did it come from? They couldn't really explain that to me. Why do we do what we do when this is what's going on in the Gospels? We've got all this wonderful teaching and healing in the Gospels, not a single church service, but everything we do seems to be revolved around putting services on. What's all that about? And then I had questions about hell. I can't really find this hell doctrine in the Gospels. Are we right on that? And so I had these questions right from the beginning of my journey in Christian faith. And then I went into the world of ministry, became a priest, became a teacher. And I think, like a lot of pastors and teachers, we're involved in the process of helping people in their intellectual journey. It's not just nurturing their feeling of well-being in relationship with God in a community of faith. If you're going to preach sermons, if you're going to teach, of course, you're wanting to help people in their intellectual journey, and you'll be forced to engage, therefore, with the scriptures and all the things that don't line up with the familiar stories. And so every preacher is familiar with the feeling of being presented with a text they've got to preach on Sunday morning and thinking, what in the world is going on there? And I have to make sense of that. And you find a way of dancing around it for Sunday morning, but in your mind, you're thinking, I've got to get back to that and work out what's really going on there. But most priests and pastors are simply kept too busy ever to go back and ask those questions. And I've just been lucky enough to have moments in my life where I've had the time and the freedom to go back and say, I don't think that really is a God story. What really is happening there? And finding this other layer of story that we were talking about before.
That's beautiful, Paul. Beautiful.
In your books, you've both deconstructed a lot of the stories that we take as gospel, Moses, burning bushes, all kinds of stories. And Paul, you've talked about retroactive prognostications, prophecies that were actually written after the events happened. Seán, you and I have talked about, various things where they're actually three stories all pushed together to make one story.
Yes.
I mean, when you see this, when you know this and you bring this up, if you do bring it up to any of your friends who are still in ministries, what is their reaction?
I've been blackballed by I've been thrown out of so many places at this stage. I don't know where I'm welcome anymore. I mean, I have a community of my own at this stage. I'm spiritual director for a group called Companions on the Journey. But occasionally I'll kind of piss them off as well by stuff that I'm saying. So for me, I differentiate between truth and fact. I believe that something can be truthful but not factual, and something can be factual but not truthful. Because my definition of truth is that something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with source, and something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with source. So I'm going to do what Paul did a while ago now and just take another story from Jesus' teaching. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. And Christ is being grilled by one of the teachers of the law and asked him, what is the greatest commandment of the law? There's 613 precepts. And Christ says, love the Lord your God with your whole heart and your whole soul and your whole mind. And I'm going to give you the second one, even though you didn't ask for it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And the guy says, yeah, but who's my neighbor? And then Christ tells this great story. He says there was a certain man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was mugged and left for dead at the side of the road. And a few hours later, there was a priest from the temple going down, and he sees this fellow Jew lying on the side of the road, and he passes by, because if he touched him, he'd be unclean. He couldn't go into the temple to offer sacrifice, so he passes by. A bit later, a Levite goes down, and they're kind of the temple sacristans and police. He goes down, sees a fellow Jew, ignores him and keeps going because he's under the same edict. Touch him and you're unclean. And then a Samaritan goes down, they're kind of the sworn enemies of the Jews, and he sees a Jew lying at the side of the road. He pours wine into his wounds to cauterize him, puts him up on his own donkey, takes him down to Jericho, checks in at a hotel, looks after him for a few days, says to the innkeeper, I have to go off on business for a few days. Would you look after him and I'll pick up the tab when I come back? And then Christ says, which of those three people was neighbor to the man who fell among robbers? Now, if I was a reporter from the Jerusalem Post and I said, this is really fishy, and I go to the temple, I knock on the door, and the high priest comes out and he says, here's the story. Did such and such a thing happen? And the guy goes in and looks, guys, anybody down in Jericho in the last few weeks? No, never happened. I go over to the Levites, knock at the door. Anybody of you guys go down to Jericho in the last few weeks? And such and such. Hey, anybody go down to Jericho in the last few weeks? No. And I come back to Jesus and I say, that was a crock. It never happened. I go down to Jericho and I check out, I go to all the hotels and say, there's only 6 hotels there. I check everybody. I say, did a Samaritan come in here with a Jewish man and pick up the tab and look after him? No bloody way, I certainly remember that. So you go back to Jesus and you're the kind of journalist for the Jerusalem Post. And you say, this never happened, that's a crock. Now, did it happen, as Paul is saying? Probably never happened. But anybody who got the message was transformed by the realization that, that is who neighbor is. Neighbor is the person who is in need. And it was very interesting that the way he chose that story was a masterpiece. Because when the Israelites entered the promised land allegedly in the year about 1210 BCE, they started in Jericho and they wiped out Jericho, and then they spent 200 years wiping out the country, and they destroyed Jerusalem in the year 1010 BCE, 200 years later. So they start in Jericho and wind up in Jerusalem. And Jesus starts the story in Jerusalem and winds up in Jericho. So he's reversing the journey. So it's a conquest of spirit, not a conquest of military conquest. So here again, you have this extraordinary story, which, if you're trying to understand it rationally and logically, it doesn't make any sense, and it didn't probably happen. But when you understand, if you're transformed by the message you got, then it's really true in the sense in which I define truth.
Which, if you compare that to the story of Moses, there isn't anything in that story that is particularly, it's information,
Yes.
not
Yeah.
transformational.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
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 What about you, Paul?
I get a whole spectrum of response from people in the community of faith. Every morning I begin with correspondence, and the full spectrum is there from people who've read my books and said, thank you so much. I'm on a new journey of discovery, or I've always thought this. Thank you for articulating it, to people who are really going to town, threatening me with the worst kind of tortures in this life and beyond, of course, because they can threaten those as well.
Yeah.
But I think one of the most interesting categories of response I receive is from clergy, pastors, priests who've just retired, who will say,
okay,
thanks, Paul. I've been watching your videos. I've been reading your books. I've been retired for 6 months, and I've come round to your way of thinking, which is lovely and very gratifying.
Yeah.
But here's someone else who may have been in ministry for 40, apparently teaching the orthodox thing, not offending the mainstream view, not having the freedom to go back to those texts that have puzzled them, and just 6 months of having the freedom to do that. And they're thinking, yes, I didn't think that was a God story. Or yes, I did think that was a different kind of entity. And again, it just shows what happens when you've got the freedom to be in front of the ancient text, to have the time to look at it, look at the things that don't make sense, read literature around it, not be beholden to make it all make sense by Sunday morning. Once you've got that freedom, other possibilities emerge that have nothing to do with propping up the institution and its familiar stories, or appeasing a congregation who already think they know what's true and what's fact. It's very encouraging to hear that this change can happen, but it is an illustration of how conservatizing the dynamics of communities of faith can be.
So it's interesting, Paul. I love that. It reminds me of this flaming statement in the book of Revelation. I wish that you were neither hot or cold, but because you were neither hot nor cold, but only lukewarm, I will vomit you out of my mouth. And that's my experience, that the people who are kind of viciously anti-Paul Wallis, there's energy in that, at least. And the people who are saying, I totally agree with you, and I'll be preaching this next Sunday myself. But the people who are on the sideline, who are afraid to kind of make waves, that's the worst category for me, that they're neither hot nor cold, but they're lukewarm. Now that the horse is gone, they're going to close the stable door when they can add nothing or be of assistance to nobody. So of the three groups of people that are responding to you, I think that group is the most pitiful of all.
Yes, I think, there are people who will sort of catch sight of what I'm saying, and then the response is, I don't want to think about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because they can feel it's going to rattle some familiar beliefs, and they would rather continue with beliefs that might not be correct than have to do all the thinking. And that is something that I don't have a lot of respect for, when the things you're thinking about are so fundamental and so important. How can you be happy with, no, I don't want to think about that. I don't want to think that God might be different to what I thought. I don't want to think that I could have a more empowered life than I've been living. I don't want to think that hell might not be true when I've been preaching it for 10 years. What more important things do you have to think about? Sometimes it's not the more important things to think about. It's just that people feel so harassed and harried by the circumstances of life and having to keep the show on the road financially. They don't feel they've got the emotional energy to go there. But personally, I've never really been able to identify that, because, as I said earlier, from the age of 5, I was an intellectual troublemaker, and I wouldn't be fobbed off. And I prefer to do business with people who don't want to be fobbed off with something that is not right, that is a distortion.
Beautiful. So it reminds me of that beautiful passage in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. Thomas says, it happens in 6 stages. Those who seek should not stop searching until they find. And when they find, they will be disturbed. And when they're disturbed, they will marvel. When they marvel, they will rule. And when they rule, they will rest. But particularly clergy who have kind of dedicated themselves allegedly to spreading the good news, and they're on the road, they're searching in some way, whether it's in the seminary or whatever, and then they find an uncomfortable truth and they back off. they're afraid to upset their congregation or their superiors or whatever. And so having set out with all the kind of enthusiasm of the youth to find the truth, and they find the truth, and they say, no, I want to go back to the safety of Mother Church. This is too difficult. And that's really upsetting, that they had a glimpse of the kingdom, and they backed off and walked themselves back down into purgatory.
Yeah. And to be fair, I mean, some churches will get very aggressive towards you if you're not parroting all the same doctrines. Not all churches are like that, thank goodness. But some are. And with some, like my friend in Watchtower, you're taking your life in your hands to disagree with the authorities in your organization.
So, and that, sorry, go ahead, Sandie.
If the Bible is a mashup, of stories and fiction, and what was the purpose of that? I mean, was it intentional, or was it one of those things that just started and gradually got added to and became something else entirely? I mean, as an editor, somebody must have been putting that book together and looking at all the source material.
Right.
How did it come about?
The questions I ask myself about it is, I look at, what are we talking about? When did it happen? For whom was it intended? And what was the message of it? And so in some senses, in the case of the Hebrew scriptures particularly, the writings come from basically two sources, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, which split up after the death of Solomon in the year about 930 BCE. And now you've got a tradition which is building in the north. That's called the Elohistic tradition, and in the south, the Yahwist tradition. And so they're going kind of parallel, and they're at variance with each other, because the northern kingdom now is kind of focused on prophets and kings, whereas the southern kingdom is focused on the temple, which is there, and it's focused on the temple and priesthood, and the northern kingdom is on kind of kings and the prophets. So they're diverging. And then the northern kingdom was destroyed in 722 by the Assyrians. And they managed to kind of take some of their writings and bring them down to south, and they're hidden in the temple in Jerusalem, and rediscovered about the year 610 BC by renovations in the temple. And now they're amalgamated with the southern group. And then at 589 BCE, the Babylonians come in and they deport the last two tribes of Israel. And so these guys at this stage are, desperately trying to survive. 10 of the northern tribes are gone forever. They'll never be heard of again. And so now there's only two tribes left, and they're trying to create some kind of a system that will allow them to kind of retain their ability as a group. So they come up at that stage. That's when the notion of circumcision is created to differentiate us from the other people. Table fellowship. We can't eat with other people outside the system. The Sabbath is created then. The clean day of the week from the other. Kosher foods versus treif is created. And so now they're trying to maintain their their separateness, and they did a great job in it. And then they pulled together all these traditions, and we can see four different strands. You have a Yahwistic tradition, you have an Elohistic tradition, you've got a Deuteronomic tradition, and you've got a priestly tradition. And they're squishing all these together as kind of the story that will allow them to create origin myths, for instance, like a Moses character who never actually existed, and an Exodus that didn't ever actually happen. But they're facing the possibility of a new Exodus, because Cyrus the king, the Persian, who overthrew the Babylonians in 539 BC, is setting the remnant of the Jews free to go back to the land and rebuild their temple. And so now they're going back, to kind of reconstitute what they had, and they're holding desperately to this origin myth of who we were, what's going to hold us together, and what's going to prepare us for the future. So any kinds of stories that will kind of encourage the people to retain their individuality as a nation and a group, that's going to be, front end of the whole thing. So it was something that worked so well that 2,500 years later, in spite of all of the vicissitudes that this people have experienced as a people, that they still managed to survive. Just wave after wave after wave of anti-Semitism, and they've managed to survive somehow. That this extraordinary book, if you know how to handle it and how to deal with it, has provided the fodder and the inspiration for a nation to survive for 2.5 millennia, when a whole bunch of other people have disappeared. So for me, that's the beauty of it.
Well, Paul, you suggest that many of the ancient stories in the Bible were edited, mistranslated to promote Yahwist orthodoxy.
Yes.
Why?
So I just... Well,
you go.
I'll
Keep
add
going
a
with
couple of moments in that overview that Seán just gave us. A king comes along, King Hezekiah, who is a Yahwist, and his personal spiritual advisor is a Yahwist high priest, Hilkiah. And I don't know who came up with the idea, whether it was Hilkiah or Hezekiah, but I can imagine Hilkiah might have said, "Sire, do you not think it would be good if all your people worship the same God that you do?" Yes, I'd rather think that is a good idea. And so begins a cleanup of what Judaism is going to be. It's going to be Yahwist monotheism. So all the people worshipping the king's God means, well, we don't need these other priesthoods, do we, sire? No, we don't. We don't need these other temples. No, we don't. You're quite right. And all these carvings of the other Elohim, the ones that aren't Yahweh, we don't really need them either, do we? No, you're quite right. We do have some of these in our local temple. We'll send the army in and get rid of them. And so there begins a process of ritual reform. I mean, it sounds so neat and clean, ritual reform, but it did really mean slaughtering other priesthoods, demolishing temples, breaking the horns off altars, defacing ancient art, obliterating the cultural memory of his people. And we're told what the cultural memory of his people were. If you read 1 and 2 Kings or the book of Jeremiah, we're told that Jewish people remembered a world full of powerful entities: Milcom, Dagon, Chemosh, Asherah, Baal, a few others besides. They remembered the Seva Hashemayim, the sky fleet, the airborne armies, these multiple beings of whom Yahweh was one, but that memory now has to be gotten rid of. And so we've got the defacing of art, the demolishing of temples, the slaughtering of priesthoods. That's the ritual reforms. And then we've got the reforms of the scriptures that Seán was referring to. So we get to Hezekiah's grandson, Josiah, and the high priest sidles up to him and says, "Oh, look, we found this book of the laws of Yahweh. You're a Yahwist, I'm a Yahwist. We should be following these laws, shouldn't we?" "Yes, we should. Do you think we should sort of put this book together and get it more widely known, read in public, so that people understand that there's one God, one king, one high priest, one temple in Jerusalem, one place to bring all your taxes and tithes?" "Yes, I think it's a very good idea, Uncle Hilkiah," says the boy King Josiah. And so now we've got the scriptural reform, where not only the ancient ritual practice, but all the scrolls and stories that represent the cultural memory are now going to be edited, brought into a single book, so that by the time of Cyrus, and we've got Ezra, a senior priest, now heading things up, we can pull this book together that essentially transforms Judaism into a belief system. And by the time Josiah has died, I think it's only a few years after that, there are no more Jewish kings. You've only got the high priestly family and the book of the laws of Yahweh. And now Judaism can survive even the loss of the monarchy, because it's got its book and its high priesthood for a little bit longer. And so that process of reform totally changed what Judaism was, what the belief and memory of the people of Israel and Judah was, which is a canon of paleo-contact, in my view, or what scholars would call a polytheistic religion. And it's now been pared down until it's Yahwist monotheism, only one God and him Yahweh. Never mind that a lot of the Yahweh texts don't fit with that narrative at all. We can gloss over it as best we can. So as an example of the glossing over, you've got the book of the prophet Jeremiah, and the writer has guaranteed that we will never forget that in the 8th century BCE, on every high hill and under every green tree, there were installations to celebrate someone other than Yahweh, to celebrate Asherah. But the narrator's voice, the voice of Jeremiah, reports this fact and then adds the gloss, "Isn't that terrible?"
Yes.
And so now we've got a separation between the information the book has given us this polytheistic or paleo-contact narrative on the one hand, a memory of a whole spectrum of beings. And now we've got this new agenda that says we're going to describe that as idolatry. We're going to describe that as apostasy so that we can remember and put it all to one side because we're now good Yahwist monotheists. And you see that process happening even within the book of Jeremiah itself. As soon as the value is placed on those old stories, isn't this awful? Yeah. You're forced to agree. Yes, it is awful. And so we remember, but don't remember.
Okay. Paul, you need to take that dialogue you just created, just backward and forward between the young king and the high priest. You need to put that on stage. That was absolutely brilliant. That backwards and forward, deadly serious. I can imagine myself being present in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very similar to what happened in England during the religious reforms there, where you've got Henry VIII, he comes in, brings all these religious reforms. Yeah. Now he dies, and suddenly there's this great power vacuum, and you've got a boy who's, 9 years old, who's become king. And what happens is two families come alongside him and say, we'll look after the boy king. And their real agenda is not to look after the boy king, but to push the religious reforms forward. Yes. And I think that's exactly what happened with Josiah, where he's got the royal scribe and the high priest whose agenda is to push the religious reform forward, to bring Yahwism to the fore. And it was a great opportunity when a boy who was, 8 years old when he became king?
Right.
Ascended to the throne, because that's now the beginning of the takeover of the narrative controllers, the high priest and high priestly family.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I love it.
Well, here's the question.
It would make a good play, wouldn't it?
It would make a great play. The dialogue was excellent. It's like you were just ad-libbing it.
So tell me, what might global religion look like if reincarnation, divine feminine wisdom, multidimensional reality had remained core teachings?
So I think it needed to go through some separate kinds of upgrades. It had to be tested in some senses against kind of the reality of life on planet Earth. And in some senses, I'm actually very, very optimistic. I don't know if you guys have ever come across the work of a guy called Stan Grof. He was a Czechoslovakian psychiatrist who was using LSD initially, but then he developed breath work. But he has this concept called the perinatal matrices, that the adult neurotic behavior correlates with the difficulties during pregnancy and the birthing process. And he claimed that there are 4 stages. That the first stage is to ask the question, is the in utero a good experience for the baby or not? Is mother healthy? Is she doing drugs, or is she in a vicious relationship? So what was it like for the child like in utero? That's first stage 1. Stage 2 is the contractions begin. The wall is coming together. This roof is coming down. The floor is coming up, but the cervix is still closed. So there's no way out, and the child is freaking out. The third one is the cervix is now open and the child is spelunking through the birth canal, but it could take anywhere from 2 hours to 48 hours. And then the fourth piece is the child is out, there's bright lights, there's loud noises, and the umbilical cord is cut. And he claimed that depending on which stage is most difficult for the child, there'll be corresponding adult neurotic behavior. Now, I extend that. I think that that's what's happening globally. That literally the Gaia herself is pregnant with the next stage of human development. And I asked myself the same 4 questions. Is the planet Earth right now, is it a healthy utero right now? And it's not. There's lots of pressures. It's crazy making. The next thing is the cervix is still closed, but the contractions are beginning. We can see that in worldwide movements. There's contractions happening. The next thing is, will we make it through the birth canal? And then what happens at the other side to this new world that we're going to inherit? But I believe that there are doulas and midwives at both sides of the veil, that there are angelic beings, light workers at the other side and at this side, and that the job of these people is to kind of make sure that it's a healthy baby, and that the baby then is educated to kind of be able to survive and thrive in a totally new world. So for me, I'm really, really positive that, the time was not opportune, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, that it needed the complexity of the 21st century in order to kind of really tell us what a new world would look like. And I think the next stage is, I call it Homo spiritualis, that Homo sapiens sapiens is trifurcating at this stage. It's a vision I had many years ago, that there's the group I call Homo sociopathicus, who are the group who are the oligarchs trying to kind of just regard the planet and the people as simply resources for their agenda. And then Homo Artificialis, the transhumanist movement that these guys are trying to create, who are hackable and programmable. And then the third group I call Homo Spiritualis, that they're people who are literally, they're ready at this stage to birth the kind of a Christ consciousness, and that people who are waking up, like Paul, you and you, Sandie, are providing an opportunity for people to speak to that new reality, that it's up to these people to kind of birth the child and to be the midwives and the doulas for this process. But that it wouldn't have been possible heretofore, and that we needed the trials and the kind of the persecutions and the craziness of our times in order to kind of create the contractions that would initiate the birthing process.
Wow. I like that. It really does speak. Can't argue with that. We're seeing that unfold now.
Yeah, absolutely.
That should be an entire book, Seán, that the three kinds of Homo sapien. I think that's a wonderful picture of what's happening. That really could be a book. And I agree with you. Everything you just said, I would say amen to. I do think that's where we're at. And I'm very encouraged to hear from people every week who are on their way out of that contracted, painful place where they have been harried, harassed, manipulated, and now they're in a place of appetite and freedom. I want to know what's really going on. I want to know what's really possible for us. And they're on this new journey as a seeker. And I hear this from people well into their 90s, from week to week, who contact me and say, I do not believe what I believed 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And I'm now on a quest to find out what is possible, who we really are, what is our place in the cosmos, what kind of life can we have, what kind of society can we build. And I think it's unusual to hear that kind of excitement and appetite on people through all the age spectrums right into their 90s. But it's where we're at right now. And I think a lot of people, it's not just a waking up process, but because we're coming from a pressured place, there is a real sense of determination to find what's the alternative to what we've been through. What is the alternative to the kind of societies we've constructed, but with a real excitement and appetite to see something happen. I think that's where we're at.
That's beautiful.
So what do you think would happen if the church were to come clean and about everything that had been edited and misinterpreted, should we say, or deliberately omitted? What do you think would happen?
I think that would be another way of the church keeping control of the situation. I don't think we can depend upon the organizations anymore. If we're dependent upon them to beat their breasts and say we were wrong, we're going to say, here's disclosure for you. This is a ground-up movement. It's not a top-down movement. And if we revert to kind of waiting for authority figures to reveal the truth to us, we're just going to lock ourselves back into the same cycle. That disclosure and that evolution is not going to happen from the top down. There's going to be individuals coming together in little groups, study groups, or kind of writing books or doing podcasts like you're doing, Sandie, that we're creating kind of, each of us is a neuron on a kind of a metaphysical circuit. And that we're coming together as individuals and as small communities, sharing our insights and our hopes with each other. And so that it's not the era of mega churches. I wrote a manifesto years ago where I said that this is the end of looking to Rome and Mecca for our spirituality. That has to come from the ground up. The circuitry of individual people and smaller communities coming together and sharing their insights with each other. So I don't want to see the churches doing this. Yeah.
Paul?
Yeah.
Yes, I do agree with what you just said, Seán, but I must say I do applaud what happened in 2009 when we had some very senior figures within Roman Catholicism inviting people all around the world to go back to the Bible and to realize that we might not have been reading aspects of it correctly, that there may be extraterrestrial civilizations attested to in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this was the message we were hearing from Monsignor Corrado Balducci, who was a senior advisor in paranormal ministry, from the Reverend Dr. Guy Consolmagno, senior astronomer for the Vatican Observatory, Father Jose Gabriel Funes, the director of the Vatican Observatory. They're very senior people. We know that they were speaking really for the Curia in that moment in 2009 when the Pontifical Academy of Sciences had convened this colloquium. And clearly there was some confidence, therefore, that we could have conversations about re-understanding the scriptures and re-understanding the scope of God in the light of new information within the community of faith. Now, the Roman Catholic Church can do that to an extent because it has doctrines, it has dogmas, but it is a huge institution with a momentum all its own. And similarly in the Church of England, we have doctrines in the Church of England, but we don't have 12 fundamental truths that everybody has to agree to in order to go to church. And I think that those big structures are probably better able to adapt to evolving thinking. Not that they do necessarily, but they're better able to. Whereas if you've got a church that exists on the basis of a doctrinal statement with 12 fundamental truths in it, I think those are the churches that are really going to struggle when suddenly you've got to review items 1 to 5. So I think it could get very messy. But as you were saying, Seán, people, whether they're in communities of faith or not, are making this journey in other places. They're finding connections in other places. They're finding community in other places as new forms of spirituality, mysticism, new information emerges. And of course, there has always been mysticism around religious institutions, places for people to go that may give them the freedom to explore further, or may be a bridge to a much, much bigger world. So I think Meister Eckhart was a bridge to a much, much bigger world. I think St. Francis of Assisi was the same in his day, though I think we've forgotten a lot of what he was really offering to people. I think always the mystical traditions, the apophatic tradition that we began with, give people a way out of this tiny boxed world of certainties that can sometimes be quite toxic, and into a bigger world where they're freer to make a more expansive and exciting journey.
Beautiful, beautiful. So I agree. And so it's interesting to me that I think the Reformation in 1517 was necessary because of the excesses of Rome and the Vatican at the time. What the Protestants forgot was, I think, was mysticism, monasticism, and Mariology. They can be more or less thrown out. And that they are coming back to, for me, very importantly, Mariology, a recognition of the feminine face of God. When I think of, for instance, Christ consciousness, I see Christ consciousness as the immanence of, the kind of the masculine face of the divine, and I see Mary as kind of, I call it Christa consciousness, the kind of the incarnation of the feminine face of the transcendent. And so going back to some kind of Marian devotion, not just kneeling in front of statues, but the realization that statues are just to raise the mind to the reality of what lies beyond the veil. And so practices like, for instance, the rosary coming back in some Catholic circles, but this kind of re-emphasis on the kind of the mysticism of the feminine, which has been lost. So these for me are the kind of the threads, I think, that are pulling together the garment, or weaving the extraordinary garment of spirituality, mystical spirituality for the 21st.
So if Yahweh were to join this conversation, what would you say to him?
Well, as Paul has so eloquently pointed out, there's no such word. That's an import, it's a tetragrammaton. So it depends on who presents himself as Yahweh. If it's an extraterrestrial with an agenda of domination, I say, go screw yourself.
Well, that's nice and blunt. And
that's nice and blunt. If it was an encounter with the transcendence of the divine, it wouldn't be calling itself Yahweh. So it would have to kind of introduce itself in some different fashion. And at that stage, I'd be all ears and all heart and all soul.
Paul?
Yes, I think one answer would be to say, get in line, because there's always been a sky council, according to our ancestors. When we look to the non-human layer for the explanation of why things are the way they are, so many indigenous traditions around the world speak about a plurality of non-human others who appear to have a stakeholding in Project Earth. And so Yahweh really would have to get in line. And I actually believe that we are in contact, that the way things work on planet Earth is because of compacts and agreements between a multiplicity of other demographics. And Yahweh would find himself one of a great many. I mean, I remember this was back in 2008, I think, when Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, the Russian Prime Minister, was caught on a hot mic, and he said every new Prime Minister is given a dossier detailing the civilizations we're already in contact with. And the interviewer said, how many? And he said, I don't want to say how many. That would panic people. I love that he thought it was the number that would panic people and not the fact that there's ET layer to the story in the first place. So, I mean, I find that comforting. I do believe that there are agreements and compacts in place that maybe not quite as watertight as they've been in the past. A spectrum of agendas. I think some are here because they love humanity and they want to support human ascension. Some are here for more exploitative reasons, but there's some kind of a balance of power that's there that means that we're not suddenly going to be vulnerable to one individual using the name of Yahweh turning up and saying, I'm in charge here. There'll be plenty turning around saying, no, you're not.
I love that. Yeah. So for me, it reminds me of, I use as an example, the colonialist powers of Europe in the 16, 17, 1800s that kind of visited Africa, particularly because I know Africa very well. So there were some people who went, to conquer for king and country. And there were some people who went to grab land. And there were some people who went as kind of anthropologists to study languages and cultures, and there were some who went, with wanting to kind of upgrade the medicine of Africa and save, the infant mortality rate. And there were some people who went as missionaries to preach the word. There were some people who went as educators. So there were a whole series of agendas coming from the same tiny little continent called Europe, and that visited Africa. And I think the same thing is true of planet Earth vis-a-vis extraterrestrial energies right now. As you say, there are very different agendas. And the question is, to whom are we going to listen? And what are the agreements among these people? What's the kind of the balance of powers among those sky beings? And how much latitude are the kind of the dark forces going to be allowed to kind of, they've certainly seemed to be calling the shots for the last maybe 10,000 years. So the question is, are they going to be reined in at this stage? And are we going to call in, ourselves? But to call them in, I think we need to understand who we are, because as long as we identify with the three-dimensional beings, we're kind of powerless vis-a-vis these guys. When we realize that we have volunteered to incarnate on a three-dimensional planet, but we in fact are holographic fractals of Source itself. And a hologram is an entity that contains the totality of itself and every one of its component parts. And a fractal is a pattern that repeats at an infinite number of scales, so that every single one of us actually is a bite-sized piece of God. And so until we elevate our self-understanding, then we're kind of, we're under the thumb of what appears to be higher entities, more intelligent beings and more powerful beings, but they're not more powerful. We have chosen, I think out of the love of our real love to kind of temporarily forget who we really are in order to kind of have a nostalgia for home and work our way back through the series, go from our physical body to the etheric, to the astral, to the mental, to the psychic, to the soul body, until we merged finally with God. And that we're absolutely powerful beings. And that, we're not going in there begging, for assistance from people who are more powerful than we, but rather we're going in as equals, and not disidentifying now with lesser versions of ourselves in order to kind of re-identify with greater versions of ourselves. And that's why I think of Mother Mary, I created a statement a few days ago that when Mary said to the angel Gabriel, fiat voluntas tua, your will be done, she created the first fiat currency, and the currency was love. But the price of the currency is to be willing to give birth to God, and that's our job. That every single one of us, as Meister Eckhart said so powerfully in the 1300s, every single one of us is meant to be a mother of God. And so until we identify with that level of ourselves, we're beggars looking for help from more powerful beings.
Well said. Before we close, I want to ask each of you something more personal. I've got 2 questions for you. And I'm asking this, I want you to answer not as scholars, but as men who've spent a lifetime searching for deeper truths. The first question is, if humanity finally let go of the old fear-based image of God, what would become possible that isn't possible now?
Brilliant question.
I think psychological health. I think to be creative, curious, compassionate really requires to be in a headspace where you're not terrified of doing the wrong thing or believing the wrong thing. So I think the brakes get taken off our curiosity and our confidence and the compassion, the imagination with which we live when we take away that distorted image of God. I think it takes the brakes off us emotionally, how we feel about our lives, how we feel about ourselves. I mean, just picture what happens to a person when their self-esteem is imagine that at a societal level. All of a sudden, we can be asking far more courageous questions about how we live and how we organize ourselves. I think a huge downward pressure would be relieved by moving away from that image of God. I find that happening for individuals who contact me, and I think we would see that at a societal level, and it could be the most fantastic renaissance of human endeavor that we've seen in hundreds and hundreds of years.
Beautiful, Paul. Beautiful. I agree completely with that. And so for me, it's about the question of, this beautiful statement in Hinduism, namaste, that the divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. And then this download I got in my dreams a few years ago when I asked for a definition of Christ consciousness. And that Christ consciousness was the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all beings. Every single oak tree, every bunny rabbit, every human being, that literally the ability to see the divine in the other. And it would begin, as Paul says, with individual encounters, that I can see the divine in you. Sandie, even I just looking at your image now, I really recognize the divine in you, that you're a bite-sized piece of God who volunteered for incarnation in a three-dimensional reality. And that then you fractalize that up to communities, recognize it in other communities, and finally recognize it in a global community and recognizing it in all species with whom we share the planet, and ultimately with all beings in the cosmos itself, both the physical and the metaphysical cosmos, that there is nothing in existence that is not, a reflection of the divine. And so I think you see this fractalization of this realization of Christ consciousness through the various layers.
I think you guys should get together and rewrite the Bible 2.0, and you should call that book You're a Divine, what is it? A bite-sized piece of God.
Okay.
Love
Yes.
that phrase. Love it.
That's
But I
great.
think we do need a new Bible for sure. Second question. What is the one truth you've uncovered in your own journey that you believe the world most needs to hear right now, but is still afraid to face?
I would definitely off the top of my head, be a kind of a re-engagement with the reality of reincarnation. The realization that we didn't just get one shot at it, that we're eternal beings, that who came here to generate experiences for God. That if God is all that exists, no experiences are possible. So God self-fractures in a sense. What they call in Hebrew they call netzotzot, the sparks of the divine. And that's how God generates experiences. And so reincarnation is the realization that we keep kind of incarnating until we learn to be loving beings in all circumstances. Whether I'm born in a crippled body or I have an IQ of 190, whether I'm born into a billionaire family or to a homeless person or whatever, that no matter what situation which I find myself, I realize it's an opportunity to learn how to love anyway. And so for me, the kind of connecting with reincarnation through personal experiences, going back 40 years at this stage, for me, that was the single biggest eye-opener, that I get as many chances as I need until finally I realize that the only thing that exists is love.
Yeah, great. I think I would boil that down to profound belief, awareness, confidence that you and I are here to have experiences and to learn love. And I think for me, that's a wonderful place to go, because from an earlier religious iteration of myself, where it was a very complicated world, where somehow you had to calculate what God wanted and didn't want, and everything has that anxiety undergirding it. Am I doing it right? Am I headed in the right direction? I think to put all that to one side and say, no, you're here to have experiences.
Yes.
Have the best experiences that you can.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're here to learn love. Experience it and do it as best as you can. And I think that is a great start point to go at life with more confidence and more courage, to have a better human experience.
Amen, brother.
Father Seán ÓLaoire, Paul Anthony Wallis, thank you for such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. It didn't go in the direction that I thought we were going to go, but actually it's exactly what I needed to hear. And I hope our viewers too. And, for our viewers, there's a lot here to digest, but there are two things that occur to me. Maybe the real invitation here isn't just to rethink what we've believed, but to remember what we've always known. Because what if myth wasn't fantasy, but a memory so old, so sacred, and so buried that we mistook it for metaphor? And what if the greatest blasphemy isn't questioning what we've been told, but refusing to question it at all? Paul Anthony Wallis is a former archdeacon and best-selling author of the Eden series of books, which investigate ancient texts for evidence of ET contact, rebranded gods, that's a great phrase, and lost human origins hidden beneath biblical narrative. For more information about his books, events, and research, visit paulanthonywallis.com and the Fifth Kind YouTube channel. And Father Seán ÓLaoire is a Catholic priest, psychologist, interfaith scholar, and best-selling author of several bold and insightful explorations of biblical myth, spiritual wisdom, and the true nature of divinity beyond dogma, including the book that I love, Setting God Free, Moving Beyond the Caricature We've Created in Our Own Image. And you can learn more about his work and ministry at spirit.com. Sandie Sedgbeer, you've been listening to an episode of the Synergy Sessions, which currently airs on the first Thursday of every month. Till the next time, it's goodbye from me. And thank you again to Paul Anthony Wallis and Father Seán ÓLaoire.
If today's conversation sparked your curiosity, you'll love our other shows. The Synergy Sessions, where leading-edge thinkers collide in bold, unscripted dialogues that ignite new possibilities between realms and reason, where we journey into the mysterious consciousness, energy, and the hidden layers of reality, where science converges with spirit in ways you've never imagined. And the No BS Spiritual Book Club, where leading-edge new thought speakers, teachers, authors, and luminaries who've walked this path before you share the 10 books that had the biggest impact on their life journey. All 3 shows are available on YouTube, Spotify, Substack, and all major podcast platforms. For more information, visit sedgbeer.com. That's SEDGBEER.com.